Hi everybody, Ryan Jackson here. I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be talking about current carrying conductors. What are they and when do you count them? Now this is going to be based on the 2020 NEC, and the section numbers have all changed from the 2017 version of the NEC, but the concepts have not. So if you're following along when we start talking about 310.14C1, if you're in the 2017 version, you'll be wanting to look at 310.15B3A, and if you're older than the 2011 codebook, you need to get a new codebook. All right, let's get started. When do you count a current carrying conductor? Well, the rule starts out by, and really, I guess we should start by saying why do you need to know what a current carrying conductor is, and that's in 310.15C1, or again, what used to be 310.15B3A. It starts out by saying if a raceway or cable has more than 3 current carrying conductors, or if cables are bundled for longer than 24 inches, ampacity adjustment is required. So looking at this photograph, we've got quite a number of conductors in it. We've got at least 9 or so ungrounded conductors, and it looks like a similar number of neutral conductors. And what we're going to be focusing on is which of those conductors do I have to count when it comes to current carrying conductors. Now, it starts off by talking about cable trays, and it points at section 392.80, and it says if you're doing a cable tray, go to 392.80, and for me to just kind of spare you the steps, here's what 392.80 says, at least for 2,000 volts and less. It says if you have multi-conductor cables like TC cable, then you only need to count the number of current carrying conductors in each cable and not the number in the entire cable tray. And then it goes on to say that if you have individual conductors, such as just 2-aught, XHHW that's TC rated, that's tray rated, then you don't need to worry about it at all. So it's just the number of conductors in each cable in the cable tray, not the total number of conductors in the tray. The next thing that we read is subsection B that says ampacity adjustment is not required for raceways that are not longer than 24 inches. All right, so looking at these raceways here, it's quite obvious that we've got more than 3 current carrying conductors, but this raceway is less than 24 inches long. We need to consider the fact, though, that a wireway is also a raceway, according to Article 100 and according to 376.2. So in this application, I would count from the top of the enclosure up to the top of that wireway. And if that distance is less than 24 inches in length, then we don't need to count the conductors in it. C is a little bit less commonly used. Ampacity adjustment is not required for direct buried cables or conductors entering a raceway up to 10 feet in length, if there's no more than 4 current carrying conductors. All right, so if you go to section 300.5D, I believe it's item 4, it says that if you have direct burial conductors like this, when they emerge from grade, they have to be in a raceway. Obviously, you're not going to have wires going up the side of a building. And that raceway has to be at least 8 feet above ground, and it has to extend down, I believe, 18 inches. So this section is recognizing the fact that, yes, you could have 4 current carrying conductors inside of that raceway, but the fact of the matter is, most of that circuit is direct burial conductors. So they're not bundled together, they're separated, and even better, they're in the dirt. So they're going to be in a cold environment anyway. So here the code is simply recognizing that, sure, the temperature may be slightly elevated inside of that raceway, but in comparison to the rest of the circuit, it's just not an issue. So we can go ahead and ignore that scenario. The last one, and it's very specific, is for AC or MC cables, but you have to meet all of the criteria here. We don't need to have any ampacity adjustment for AC or MC cables if, item 1, if there's no outer jacket over the cable. So you can buy MC cable that's rated for wet locations that has an outer sheath over it, an outer covering. You can also get it that's rated for hazardous locations that has an outer sheath over it. If it has an outer sheath, then you're going to treat it just like any other cable or raceway. But if there's no outer jacket, and number 2, there's no more than 3 current carrying conductors per cable, and again, we'll figure out how we count them, Number 3, the conductors are 12 gauge, and number 4, not more than 20 current carrying conductors are stacked or supported on bridle rings, and that's what we're looking at here is some bridle rings. So I can ignore ampacity adjustment under those specific conditions if we meet all of the conditions, not just one of them. And this condition ends when we have more than 20 current carrying conductors. And if we get more than 20, then a 60% adjustment factor applies. All right, so when is a conductor a current carrying conductor? And really, it's mainly a discussion of neutral conductors. So I go to 310.15e, and I think in previous versions that was 310.15b5. It says that the neutral conductor of a 2-wire circuit is always counted as a current carrying conductor. Matter of fact, it doesn't say that. I'm saying it because it's a fact. So here I've got just a 2-wire circuit. The hot and the neutral have 20 amps on them. Current leaving the hot, it has to come back somehow. If the only path is on the neutral conductor like that, then of course we're going to count that. So in a 2-wire circuit, we're always going to count the neutral. So looking at this box here, I have a home run down at the bottom. So that's the black and the white, and I've got 4 switches that are all on the same circuit. Okay, so I've got one hot that comes in and it's neutral in the cable. So in that NM cable, that's 2 current carrying conductors. For these first 3 switches, I've got the switch leg leaving and the neutral going with it. So 2, 2, and 2. Now, bear in mind, it doesn't matter how many current carrying conductors I have in the box. We're just talking about in the cable. The reason I wanted to show this is specifically this 4 switch here, which is a 3-way. If you look at table 310.15c1, one of the things you'll notice at the bottom of the table is it says that if the ungrounded conductors are connected in a way that you have multiple ungrounded conductors but only one would be energized, then we only need to count 1. So in a 3-way switch, we come down with the hot, we've got 2 travelers, and then we leave with a switch leg. No matter what position you put either of those switches in, one of the travelers is always on, the other is always off. So we don't need to count both travelers, right? Because there's no way that you could have them both on simultaneously. A neutral conductor that carries only the unbalanced load of the other circuit conductors is not considered a current carrying conductor. All right, so looking at this example, I've got 20 amps on line 1, 20 amps on line 2, which means I would have 0 on the neutral. So a perfectly balanced circuit, you would not count the neutral conductor. Now, of course, that seldom exists in reality, or if it does, it's only temporary until somebody turns a light on or plugs something in. So if it's perfectly balanced, we don't count the neutral. Much more importantly, we also don't count the neutral even if it's not perfectly balanced. 20 amps on line 1, 15 amps on line 2 means I would have 5 amps on the neutral. Now, if you think about it, between those 3 conductors, I essentially have 20 plus 20 amps of heat. The same way I would on this cable when I've got a perfectly balanced load. So whether the load is balanced or not really doesn't matter. The most current that I could have going through here is, the most heat is 40 amps worth of current slash heat. And the most heat that I could have going through this one is 40 amps, 20 plus 20. So I don't need to count the neutral if all it's doing is carrying the unbalanced load. It's not necessary. Same thing if I have a high leg system. This is something that when I was younger I really struggled with. I didn't know. How do you calculate the current on a high leg system, the neutral current? Well, if you think about it, it's a delta connected system, and we're really only using a single phase portion of that transformer for neutral loads, right? Because I'm not using B for my neutral. That would wipe out some equipment. So A to neutral and C to neutral is really no different than just a single phase transformer like we've been looking at. So if I have 20 amps on C, 15 amps on A, that means I have 5 amps on the neutral, and I would not need to count it because all it's doing is carrying the unbalanced load. It's the same concept with a Y-connected system. Here I have a perfectly balanced 3-phase 4-wire system, 20 amps, 20 amps, and 20 amps. That means I'm going to have 0 amps on the neutral, so I am not going to count it because that neutral conductor, again, is only carrying unbalanced load. And in this application, there is no unbalanced load. But even if there was, if I have 20 amps on phase A, 20 on phase, 15 on phase B, and 10 on phase C, then I would have to do an equation to figure out what my neutral current is. And the equation here I've written on the top right of the slide. I sub n, so neutral current, is the square root of a squared plus b squared plus c squared minus ab plus bc plus ca. And it's actually not quite as difficult, you know, as it initially looks. If you've never performed the calculation, it's just a lot of numbers and it's long. It's pretty easy, to be honest. So 20 squared plus 15 squared plus 10 squared. You're going to take that quantity and subtract a plus b plus c plus c plus a. So nice and easy. It's not too bad. Did I say a? Yeah, a times b. I want to make sure I said that right. A times b. So 20 times 15 plus 20 times 10 plus 10 times 15. So I want to make very clear that I said that correctly. And when all is said and done, we're going to end up with about 8.66 amps of neutral current in this application. We do not need to count that as a current carrying conductor, even though it's unbalanced because the neutral is only carrying the unbalanced load. But here's the key: the unbalanced load of all 3 phases. Here's a little pitfall that you can find yourself in. On a 3-phase Y-connected system like this, the neutral carries the same amount of current as the ungrounded conductors if only 2 of the phases are carrying current. All right, so take a look. I've got 20 amps on phase A, 0 on phase B, 20 amps on phase C. That means you will actually have 20 amps on the neutral. So would you count that? Absolutely, yes. So all 3 of those conductors would be considered current carrying. And of course, phase B is not, because phase B is not being used in this application. Where you would find this is for apartments, large multifamily facilities, where you have a 120/208 volt service, 3-phase service, and you're just supplying 2 hots and a neutral to the individual apartment units, so single phase 208. So here you can see all of these MC cables. They've got black, red, white, and then black, blue, white, and then red, blue, white, just to keep things balanced. And in those cables, we'll be counting all 3 of those conductors as current carrying. Now, in and of itself, that's not a problem. These cables have 3 current carrying conductors, so no big deal. If I were to bundle them together, however, then I would have 6 or 9 or 12 or however many I bundle. So that's where we need to know when I count the current carrying conductor. The last one tells us that on a 3-phase, 4-wire, Y-connected system, the neutral is counted if more than half of the load is nonlinear, because it has the effect of adding heat to the neutral. 20 amps on phase A, 20 amps on phase B, 20 amps on phase C. Now, I write down that the current on the neutral is 0, and that's debatable. Does it really have 0 amps, or does it just have heat? Here's the thing. If I have a nonlinear load, especially a odd triplet harmonic, 3rd order harmonic, 9th order harmonic, 15th order harmonic, and I'll explain that. If I have one of those, then it has the effect of adding heat on the neutral. Now, we could say that there's actually 40 amps worth of neutral current on there, and we can debate that, and quite frankly, I'm not interested, but here's the thing. It can definitely have the heat that you would expect from 40 amps of load. Without getting into power quality, we talk about reflected currents and different things, and again, whether or not that 40 amps is actually on the neutral, it has the heat as though it does. So if more than half of my load is nonlinear, then I have to count the neutral as a current carrying conductor, but only on a 3-phase, 4-wire, Y-connected system. I don't need to worry about this on single phase. I don't need to worry about it on a high leg system. It's only on this particular transformer configuration. Now, what is a nonlinear load? We need to know what that is if we're going to figure out how to deal with it. The definition doesn't help that much for most people. The nonlinear load is a load where the current waveform is different than the voltage waveform. Here we have in blue a nice sinusoidal, predictable voltage waveform, 60 hertz, just like we draw it out in school. The current waveform, however, is a bit funky, and you'll notice that it has 3 zero crossings instead of what we have for the voltage. So this might be a current waveform of 180 hertz. That would be a third order harmonic if the voltage waveform is 60 and the current waveform is 3 times that. That would be a third order harmonic. So that would have the effect of adding heat on the neutral conductor. There's an informational note that's a bit more useful than the definition, really, and it tells us examples of nonlinear loads. Electronic equipment, electric discharge lighting, adjustable speed drives, and similar may be nonlinear loads. This is becoming a bit less of a problem now than it was, say, 20 years ago, because we're able to mitigate the effects of harmonic current nonlinear loads by using capacitors and different things. But laser printers, lighting, pretty much anything you see in an office building, these things are all nonlinear loads. If we go to 310.14a2, it tells us how to deal with these once we decide that we have to have an ampacity adjustment. It says when a circuit conductor has more than one ampacity, the lowest ampacity must be used for the entire circuit. So we've got some NM cable here, and you know, the term bundling is sometimes thrown about in the NEC, and it's not defined. I think we can all agree that these cables are bundled. They're installed without maintaining spacing, is what the code actually says. So up here where they start to fan out, I've got my normal ampacity, and that would be 30 amps. Now I know you can only put 20 amps on this wire, and you know, I get that, but the ampacity is the 90-degree ampacity, and that's 30 amps. Now down here, these are bundled or installed without maintaining spacing, so I had to do an ampacity adjustment, and these conductors are only good for 12 amps now. What this rule says, again, is if a circuit conductor has more than one ampacity, the lowest ampacity has to be used for the entire circuit. So we're going to have to call this entire circuit a 12 amp conductor. Here's a very nice exception though. It says the lower ampacity can be ignored if it's not longer than 10 feet in length and not more than 10% of the entire circuit length. This is the code's way of recognizing a concept called heat sinking. If you've ever opened up a computer, you look at the processor, and that's where all the heat is generated. There's 2 things that you'll notice. One is a big fan to cool it down, obviously. But then you'll also sometimes see just a massive chunk of copper. And we put it right on top of the processor, and it's not connected to anything. It doesn't appear to do anything. So why is it there? Well, what it does is it actually sucks up heat from the processor and just deals with it, because that's what copper does, and aluminum as well, I should say. So that's why we use copper and aluminum. It deals with heat extremely well. So this is the way the code recognizes that concept. It says, okay, going through this attic here, these cables are not bundled, they maintain spacing, but then they kind of bottleneck through this raceway that's like 30 inches long. Well, that's longer than 24 inches, so an ampacity adjustment would have to happen. But this exception says, listen, if that bundled, that lower ampacity is less than 10 feet in length, and it's not more than 10% of the entire circuit length, then yes, those cables, those conductors will initially get hotter than the rest, but it will dissipate throughout the circuit. The rest of that copper will act as a heat sink. The rest of the aluminum will act as a heat sink and draw that heat out and disperse it through the entire circuit length, and it's just not an issue. So, very nice exception if you know about it. If we go back to this example, let's say that these are bundled together for 8 feet. Okay, well, we know that's not longer than 10 feet, and if all of these circuits are at least 80 feet in length, then we could forget about the ampacity adjustment, because it's not more than 10 feet in length and it's not more than 10% of the circuit length. Very nice exception that you can use more often than people think. There's a similar requirement for wireways. So here I have a metal wireway, If I go to 376.22b, I find that ampacity adjustment is required if the number of current-carrying conductors exceeds 30 at one cross-sectional area. Now, a cross-sectional area is represented by this red line. This wireway potentially has more than 30 current-carrying conductors, but not at any given cross-section. So it only applies at one cross-section. Now, if we look at this wireway, we can see that we do have more than 30 current-carrying conductors, or at least it appears so, at one cross-section. However, remember that exception we just read. These are installed without maintaining spacing for a distance of 4.5 feet. Let's say 4 feet to make the math easier. If these things are installed without maintaining spacing for 4 feet, well, that's less than 10 feet. And if the total length of the circuit from receptacle to outlet, if the total length of the circuit was longer than 40 feet, then I could completely disregard all ampacity adjustments and temperature correction because it just doesn't matter. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed our little discussion on what is and what is not a current-carrying conductor. Most of these graphics came from my newly released book, and don't worry, I write better than I speak. My newly released book, which is the 3-volume set Comprehensive Guide to the 2020 NEC. It's about 1,800 pages. It has thousands, literally thousands, of real-world photographs like the ones we've been looking at, and you can find it at iectraining.com if you're interested, or if you want PowerPoints or other books, you can go there as well. You can go to my website, and of course, don't forget to follow me on Instagram, like me on Facebook, subscribe to me on YouTube, and I don't have a Twitter account yet, so I don't have to memorize whatever you do on Twitter. By the way, if you have any code questions, you want to get in touch with me, please feel free to send me an email, ryanjackson618@gmail.com. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great day.